All right, we have a go. All right, well, good morning for people on my side of the world, and good afternoon for all of you on the panel and everyone else in the audience. So we have an amazing panel of speakers today to talk about whether or not the MENA region could actually be a different example for what an inclusive ecosystem could look like and how we can start shaping inclusive capital. And with us today, we have the amazing Mona Atoya, who is the CEO and founder of Mums World. We have Mohammed Alkesha, who is the founder and managing partner of Disrupt Tech, and also former co-founder of Fauri. We have Hadir Shalabi, who is the managing director of Talabat Egypt, and formerly who worked at Careem, but also the founder of the first, I would say, ride-sharing app in Egypt that was eventually acquired by Careem. And then we have Fadi Randour, who I feel needs no introduction, but who is currently the head of Wamda Group, former founder of Aramex. And we have with us Reggie Mauricio, who is the co-author of mine in the piece called Breaking the Mold, Can the MENA Region Be a Leader in Inclusive Capital, which we wrote for the Middle East Institute, and also is a research manager at the Legadam Center for Development Entrepreneurship at MIT. This panel is a collaboration between the Middle East Institute and the Legadam Center at MIT, of which I'm the executive director. And I think we're just gonna hop right into it and I will start by asking all of you questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience to jump in. So I wanted to start the first question really with you, Fadi, because I think you've really been a part of the journey of how ecosystems have been evolving across MENA. And I think the first interesting inflection point for the Middle East and North Africa was when Yahoo actually acquired Maktub in 2009, and you were very closely connected to that story. That was the first big exit for MENA, and that ended up seeding a number of other companies, including Soot.com, which has also moved on to seed a new generation of entrepreneurs. So I wanted to ask you and start with you and ask what was, in your opinion, how has the ecosystem been evolving? And how has the landscape of founders changed since the days of Maktub to where we are today with, say, for example, Mums World?
Good morning, Dina. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to discuss the ecosystem here in the region. I think this is a very important time in the ecosystem, and this is a very important discussion. But your question is putting a milestone that is a dozen years late. The original story of the ecosystem was when Aramex went public on NASDAQ in 1997. With all due respect, with Yahoo and Maktub, my friends there. And Maktub actually sat on the shoulders of Aramex because Aramex was the enabler of Maktub at that time. It was its first investor and actually created the original story of Souk, which was called Mazad Maktub at that time. And Aramex actually designed the logistics part with Ronnie in terms of creating cash on delivery and enabling that process, which was supposed to look like eBay, and then that didn't work. And then eventually they moved it into the horizontal e-commerce platform that it was until it was sold to Amazon. So the story started in 1997 in January, actually exactly 25 years ago. If I may put that milestone and that flag on the
ground. Yes, you absolutely may, and we apologize. You're 100% correct.
So that we don't think that the world started with social media in 2009. There was a story before. It was an orphan story. I mean, there weren't many things happening at that time. But I would also add that my good friend Rabi Ataya, Mona's brother, also launched his business at Bait during that time. And that was one of the original internet companies. So, and people keep forgetting to mentioning that. So it had raised capital. It has raised capital from Tiger also, believe it or not, back when Tiger was writing small checks. And Tiger also eventually, after they had invested with Bait, had invested in Maktub. So there is some history that needs to be fixed a little bit, and we need to give credit where credit is due.
Yes.
And these two companies continue to exist independently today. Bait.com has not been sold. It continues to operate profitably. And that's a statement that needs to be also discussed. Do you exit, or do you remain independent and keep your name and continue to operate, or do you go public and stay independent? Aramex's 40th birthday is this year. And so 40 years later, it continues to operate as an independent company with over 17,000, 18,000 employees across the world. So that is the new era. You look, the region is filled with entrepreneurial stories back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. We don't want to own that story only in the internet days. So that we're really serious about this and just put and say this is the internet age entrepreneurship, if you want, so that we are fair to everyone that came before us, and we all benefited from them also. So, and we don't fall into our own Kool-Aid and hubris here that it started with us. It didn't start with us. We were just the generation that started with the Web 1.0. So having said that, and let me take your question on change, Dina, and how the ecosystem has changed and evolved. So I think a critical element is the funding process. When back in Web 1.0, or even in the early days of Web 2.0, maybe one or two funds. I mean, when I launched Wanda Capital, maybe there were, we were the largest VC at that stage with $70 million in funding in 2014, 2015. We had launched before that MENA Venture Investments, which was probably the first angel entity, really much smaller than that. So there were, and then a couple of other funds popped up that were a bit smaller than we are. In today's world, you're talking about billions of dollars that are being deployed on a yearly basis here. So there is much more funding. The original investors and the original ecosystem builders in the region and enablers in the region were the private sector, were entrepreneurs like me, like Rabi', like MENA. We didn't have, with all due respect, much. There was some government support, but there was a lot of government talk, but not much government support on the ground, specifically in enabling either a regulatory environment or enabling a funding process to direct maybe some of the sovereign wealth funds to start thinking about building the domestic and homegrown ecosystem, which is dominated by now. So now these entities, PIF in Saudi Arabia, Mubadala, ADQ in Abu Dhabi, Al-Waha Fund in Bahrain. There are so many government and government-related institutions that are providing funding and providing funding for so many venture funds today, other than them investing directly in the ecosystem and in the companies in the ecosystem. And that has quantum leaped, and the growth has been exponential because of that funding. And and as much as we talk about everything in any ecosystem, without funding, you're not going to have an ecosystem, full stop. I mean, you can't just say we have mentors and we have fast internet and we have good infrastructure. Yes, lovely. But if you don't provide funding and risk funding and patient funding, and the government is the most patient of funders, because that's how it's enabled. Silicon Valley sits at the core of that story. Even people, we need to always remember that the ecosystem in the 50s that started the Silicon Valley was the Department of Defense and other related institutions and research and development that also enabled research at universities, which enabled the entrepreneurship ecosystem to develop. That we're just learning now. And so we are that late in that process. But that's what's different now. So when funding came, thousands of companies popped up, thousands, literally thousands. We are incapable of even having enough time to hear the pitches that we're hearing in today's world between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the other countries in the region. The amount of companies are incredible. There is user adoption now that is by the masses in the region. People pay online, people transact online, people interact online. These were things that did not happen before. And so which enables these companies to go out and build, because there are users now, there are people that are going to be paying for the services of the companies like MENA's, who are solving for specific pain points or specific challenges that are popping up in the region. And so you are seeing a much more mature system, a much less lonely system, and a much more supportive system. And thus, when all of these things started to happen, the regulators woke up, specifically during the pandemic, and the pandemic accelerated the soft infrastructure in a massive way. So if you live in the Gulf, if you live in Egypt, if you live in Jordan, or if you live in any of the countries that are around us, you find a regulator that is engaged, a regulator that wants to catch up, a regulator that wants to even be part of the cryptocurrency world, which was very scared, which thought it was an alien creature. So no, there is country adoption, there is region adoption, there is region enthusiasm. But the last point I want to say around Reg's article and your article is that the mafias that we talk about, the PayPal mafias or the Kareem mafias, or even before that, the Maktub mafias and the Aramex mafias, the tens of companies that popped up, are not recurring entrepreneurs as you would think of. These are not serial founders. These are serial employees of these companies that have gained from their stock options, made some good money, and went out and built companies. So there is a middle class and an upper middle class, the educated, the skilled, a group of people that are not were not co-founders of companies, but they were employees of those companies. And they went out to build tens and tens and tens of companies. We counted in many cases, I think in Kareem, over 100. In Maktub, there were at least 30 or 40. In Aramex, I recently counted about 75 logistics companies that popped up from that original story, all employees. None of them co-founders. So that concept that the employee, the Yahoo, the PayPal mafia were co-founders of PayPal, but the mafias of the region are all employees that are creating new wealth, generating a new generation of entrepreneurs that were not thinking of themselves as entrepreneurs before that ecosystem flourished. And that's my introduction to this story.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Fadi. I mean, I think this is exactly the conversation that we wanted to have. And I think you're 100% right about how it started. And I think Reggie and I both recognize that the mafias of our region are coming from employees of these companies. And I think that's going to be one of the big differentiators between the MENA ecosystems and what happened in Silicon Valley. Because I think we've also seen a lot of these companies employ women in very senior positions who have left and started their own businesses and become founders. And I really wanted to shift the conversation to you, Mona, not to put you on the spot, but you've built an amazing company, but the journey wasn't necessarily easy, even though the region had a lot more capital than, say, it did in the early days of this century. It wasn't necessarily an easy journey for you to raise the capital you needed to grow your company. So my question to you is, even as the ecosystem evolves, are we evolving in a way that is truly inclusive and that is really allowing women founders to be on the same equal footing as their male counterparts? And what has that journey looked like? Are we getting better? I think we would argue, probably Reggie and I, that we think we're getting better, but that's just an assumption.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Reggie, and a fantastic introduction, Fadi. I'd love to maybe just follow on some of the things that Fadi said. I have been in this ecosystem now for also 20 years. I was one of the co-founders of Bait.com, and then I started Mum's World 10 years ago. So I've actually seen the dramatic shift of the ecosystem over the last 2 decades. And because the ecosystem has changed, the fundamentals and the founders have also changed. Just to set the scene a little bit, when we started, 20 years ago when we started Bait, internet penetration was 2%. For all intents and purposes, starting a digital first business when there's 2% penetration was, on paper, not the smartest thing to do. The amount of capital being invested in startups back then were trickles. Talent back then, unlike today, there was an exodus of talent outside the region. So 20 years ago, if you were smart, skilled, and you came from a top university or had a top career, you actually did not come back to the region. Coming back to the region was considered actually to be a downgrade. In addition to that, you had infrastructure and supply chain that was very nascent. So the founders of 10 years ago, even 10 years ago, were operating in a lot more uncertainty than today. They were operating in an ecosystem that was not ready on many fronts. They had a blue ocean opportunity because there were many need gaps, but they didn't have enablers in the ecosystem that would allow them or catalyze their success. Now, fast forward till today, we're operating in a very, very different world. The fundamentals in the region have come a long way. And just, a few of the fundamentals that we're seeing today that were not there when I started Mum's World 10 years ago. First of all, we're seeing a democratization of technology. So entrepreneurs today can tap into technology to produce products and services that's readily available. 10 years ago, that did not exist. Internet penetration today is at its peak. MENA is one of the most digitally connected in the world. Again, 10 years ago, that didn't exist. Ease and cost of business setup is improved. So we're seeing an ecosystem of accelerators, incubators, mentorship programs. All of that is providing the founders of today resources, tools, and information. Back then, if you had a question, you had to kind of figure it out yourself and fail many times before you could crack that code. Today, you don't need to fail as many times. Supply chain and infrastructure enablers are much more advanced. We have free zones that offer 100% ownership. Payment gateways, back then there was one payment gateway that would work one day and would not work 1 month. So that's come a long way. And then Fadi touched on funding. I mean, we are talking about a completely revolutionized ecosystem when it comes to funding. If you look at 2022 alone in MENA, we've had 600 million funding across 127 deals. That was unheard of back then. And then with all of that, what's happening is, in fact, success breeds success, success breeds confidence. So, with this flurry of entrepreneurial businesses today, they've cited 21,000 startups in MENA today, 21,000. And these are funded startups. They're backed and supported by the government. They're backed and supported by the ecosystem. Again, that's because of the graduation, if you like, of the employees who have gone through the startup phase, who have learned through the troughs and the valleys, and are taking what they've learned and taking it back into the ecosystem and creating that network of success of other startups. And then finally, I will say, 3-4 years ago, what the pandemic did is not only did it create a new normal, it created for this blue ocean opportunity where there's more capital in the market, the infrastructure is more sophisticated, talent is growing, policy and infrastructure is encouraging entrepreneurship. You have success stories that are contagious. And then suddenly you have this blue ocean of opportunity brought forth by COVID, just essentially push starting entrepreneurs to continue to grow and to develop. So I think in short, I will say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, to start a business in this part of the world, you needed a certain DNA, you needed a certain risk aversion and a certain ability really to create with a tremendous, tremendous amount of uncertainty. And the mindset back then was not to create necessarily for an exit. The mindset was, how do I create a business that is truly going to add ecosystem value and give customer value? So, you build not to spend, you build to add value to the ecosystem. Now, that has shifted over the past 20 years. Now, entrepreneurship has become almost the flavor of the decade. You build to IPO, you build to create that unicorn. So, there has to, or there will be, I believe, a shift back to the balance of creating for value. And if that unicorn or the IPO or the exit comes while you're creating value, that's great. But if it comes independent of that, then it's, that's not what we're trying to do here as entrepreneurs.
Fantastic. And I'm still going to come back to the inclusion question, but maybe later. I'm not going to let you escape that one, Mona. But I think it's an interesting segue. And, I'm known to go off script a bit. So my apologies, Hadir and Mohammed. But Mohammed, you started Fawri during the time that Mona was just talking about. And Hadir, you joined Kareem during that same, period she's talking about. Both became unicorns. You both left. Hadir, you were an employee. Mohammed, you were a co-founder. What are your thoughts coming from two unicorns in the region who really set out to go out and become a unicorn? What are your thoughts in terms of how each of your companies, Fawri and Kareem, many of the employees in these companies have gone out and created new businesses? Mohammed, you've invested in some of them and you continue to mentor some of the employees who left Fawri to start new companies. And Hadir, I know, although you joined another company, I know you've made some of your own investments and continue to go forward and mentor other founders, and specifically female founders. And Mohammed, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on the idea of how some of these unicorns have created a whole new generation of entrepreneurs, and how has Fawri shaped the ecosystem in Egypt, specifically the fintech ecosystem? And what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, thank you. I think it's a great introduction by Fadi and Mona for the whole for this session. So Fadi was stressing on the importance of availability of funding, and Mona touched base on the availability of talent as well. So I think these are the two elements that make any success in any startup. I mean, a proper funding and talents or founders who have the capability to execute. I think there is an important point to make here is that a difference between our region and maybe the state in Silicon Valley is that there isn't much of a big corporates, good corporates that a talent would go to work for. So basically, a good successful startups like Kareem and Fawri would attract the best talents available in the market. As it grows very fast, it became very famous and it attracts the best talent in the market. So, and these acted for the act for them. So I don't like the word mafia. I think it is more in our culture, we call it as a school. So good people, talented people comes to work for a successful company, and they learn. And actually, this is why they are become very attractive for any investment later on, because they have seen what others haven't seen. They have been part of a successful journey, and this gives them a lot of experience and gives a lot of trust for investors that they will be able to execute. So I think also commenting on what Fadi started with, I mean, funding have been always around us. I mean, in different countries, but areas were faster to attract capital more than others. For example, Africa, you will see that countries like Nigeria and Kenya and before that was South Africa was ahead of Egypt, for example, attracting capital, and that's because the talents were not as as much as needed for capital to come in. And another comment that I would love to make on the what Fadi mentioned, that entrepreneurs has existed across all ages. So we have all the time successful people. What's differentiate us now is that we are in the digital economy era. And for me, it is not only about internet, it's about the penetration of smartphone. And penetration of smartphone is what made our region went or leapfrogged to a different age. And that's another differentiation between our countries and what's happening in the States and Europe. I mean, the broadband and data availability of internet at homes, we were very late because of the infrastructure was not there. So what makes the people digitally connected in our region is mainly the mobile internet, and the smartphone was the one who have created opportunity for all of us to build the companies. One final point, yes, I totally agree with Mona. I mean, the funding that was available at our time, I'm talking about 2009, 2010, was completely different than the funding now. So, I mean, a good founder will not lack no opportunity to attract the needed fund. And again, to have funding is not enough. What is needed is to build a talent, a school that can take you to become a successful company as well.
So Hadir, you represent a little bit of a different example. You went from founder to employee, and then you left when it became a unicorn, you decided to leave and took your time, and eventually you became managing director of another company in Egypt. What has been your experience with the ecosystem over the past 10 years? And you entered at a very young age.
Yeah. So first of all, it's so interesting because usually when I'm on a panel like that, I'm one of the oldest people in that ecosystem. But today I feel like the newest person to the circle. So it's actually really interesting to listen to the stories from you guys.
Are you calling them old, Hadir?
No. Just in the ecosystem. But honestly, like I always felt I had it very hard in the beginning. So it's so interesting to see Mona saying that the internet penetration was only 2%. Wow. It's impressive that you still had this kind of belief that this is actually going to work. So I started Taxi Sahel almost 8 years ago now. Of course, it was also really hard because I had no idea from where to raise money or how to raise money. But I also say that I was lucky because there was also no competitors at the time. There was no Uber, there was no Careem. So I had the ability to succeed that maybe if the same Hadir was trying to do the same business today, it wouldn't have worked. But it's also interesting, Adina, when you say that I was an employee in Careem, because I never felt that way, actually. And I want to build on Fadi's point when he mentioned that the Careem mafia or the mafia of this region were originally employees. I mean, that applies, of course, to a percentage, but a lot of us either were not employees or never felt as employees because Careem from day one made us feel as owners. They gave all of us good amounts of stocks, which unfortunately a lot of startups don't do that now, by the way. They give stock options, but they're not that much. Like your life will not transform if that startup becomes successful. Careem was very generous at the time. So they gave us stocks, they gave us ownership, and we had no playbook to follow. So in Egypt, we had to figure out what does it mean to run a company that does 100,000 trips per day. And when I started, I was 24, by the way, and my team were also very, very young. And it's not like the founders had the answer either. So eventually, after 3, 4, 5 years, we all felt like we were founders. And by time, the reason why most of us left, I guess, is because we were very lucky to learn how to be entrepreneurs using the funding that our co-founders managed to get from us. We had the ability to fail because we had the funding, we had the founders to support us. The only missing part, I would say, is the funding, because that's something we did not learn in Careem for sure. But yeah, that's how I see the Careem Mafia. And I remember someone on my team that wrote an article about that back in 2017, by the way, before it happened, expecting that it is going to happen eventually. And I see it as a good thing, because back in the day when we tried hiring talents, it was almost impossible. How would I find someone who knew how to run a fleet of 100,000 drivers? It just doesn't exist. I'm sure Taban Airmex would be one of the companies that had maybe a similar scale, but it was really, really hard to find young people that knew how to do that before, that knew how to segment a base of 5 million customers. Today, because of that, now it's much easier to attract talent because all those guys that learned that, whether in Careem or Uber or some of those big startups, are now working in all the other, let's say, growing or mid-sized startups at the moment.
So I just, quick follow-up, Hadid, I think your point about how you felt like you were a founder is very interesting to me. So do you think that that culture is integral to creating new generations of entrepreneurs? So any startup in the beginning, and then I'd be curious to know from Fadi and Mona and also Mohammed, is that the same approach that you had with your founding teams? And is that what led to a generation of new startups coming from these companies? Is it that culture of making sure that everyone feels that they are owners of this journey that is the differentiator that leads to people eventually feeling comfortable to leave and start their own company?
So, I mean,
no, go ahead. Sorry. No, Hadir, yours.
No. I mean, I think it is, to be honest. If you're the founder of a company and you have people working in 7 or 8 different markets, how can you make sure that they get you the best results possible? Because regardless of how much targets you give to them and bonuses you give to them, it's not the same like when I feel like it's my company. So I do think this is one of the main reasons why Careem succeeded, to be honest, because genuinely everyone felt like that the first few years. Yeah,
Fadi.
No question about corporate culture here. I mean, it is a differentiator in many ways for companies that are going to be successful and are going to be able to scale and are going to be not only be successful as such, but retain its talent. I mean, the feeling that you are an owner is essential, obviously. Even if you were an employee, but you felt an owner, meaning you felt you had stake in the business. You felt that you were actually building that business. You felt that the company made you know and feel and participate in the decision-making and doing the things that you need to do to solve the problems of the clients that you are serving, that you are an owner of the business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these are critical elements that are at the core of successful companies, and specifically retaining talent, because in today's world, it is so difficult, not only attracting talent, but bringing this talent to stay at the business, other than giving them stock options, which is essential. You need to give them an environment that compels them as much as possible to stay with you, so that they don't, in some cases, they don't go to build their own business, or they don't get snatched away by other companies, and not necessarily competitors, because talent in the tech space today, or in any space today, is the marketplace. All of it is going to take talent away from you. So it is no longer like my days. You know, the Aramex people were looked at by other logistics companies back then. In today's world, they're looked at everywhere. You know, the chief operating officer of BitOasis, which is a cryptocurrency, was an Aramex logistics person. So, but that skill set eventually becomes relevant in today's world. So retaining that talent, keeping that talent on the ground has to do with stock options, has to do with a sense of ownership, but that a bigger umbrella is the corporate culture of the organization, no question about that. And thus, once you do that, I mean, then you're creating a whole set of different empowerments as things change in the company. Careem got merged with Uber, and then people who were felt that they had energy and had knowledge and had capabilities and had an urge to solve another set of problems, they will actually take their leave happily, with all comfort with their previous mother, if you want, and move on to do something new. So, and then they take friends with them, they take co-workers with them, and then it's a whole set of really a virtuous cycle that is, you know, we see it live happening on the ground today.
I think I have a comment to compliment on what Hadir. The one thing that is, I totally agree with Hadir with is the capability of making mistakes. This is what makes a school successful, is that it allows employees to take decisions and you're not afraid to make mistakes. This is how they learn and become really capable of moving to the next level and become a co-founder. So this is part of the corporate culture that a successful company usually have.
The culture of accepting failure. Yep, I agree. I don't think universities have gotten that good at that yet, but it's good that companies in our region have. Reggie, I really want to move to you. And before doing that, I wanted to encourage the audience to start typing their questions to the panelists in the Q&A, because we'll start taking them quickly. But this has been an incredibly rich and enlightening conversation for me. And I know that you and everyone at MIT spends quite a bit of time thinking about this idea of how do we build more inclusive innovation ecosystems so that we're not seeing the same profile constantly emerge, the same founder become investor, the same employees become founders who then get investment from their former founders. There is a little bit of concern of our ecosystems globally not able to be inclusive of those who were not necessarily originally in the ecosystem as it was starting, or in a company as it was starting. How has this conversation now influenced your thinking, and what are your thoughts now after having heard some of the amazing remarks of Fadi and Mona and Hadir and Mohammed?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Dina. I think, and also thank you all the panelists for your insights into how this ecosystem has evolved. I think this has been building a lot of great anecdotes about how far the ecosystem has come. When you talk about 20 years ago, there's only 2% internet penetration, and really the struggles that all of you had as early founders are so different from the struggles that people are facing now. But recognizing that, still seeing that at our current moment, there is an immense amount of privilege of what it takes to be a founder in the region, especially the people who get funded, who get risk capital. So just kind of a whistle-stop tour, the typical profile of people who do get funding, they're still usually male, university educated, often abroad. They've worked for a multinational, and they have some sort of visa-friendly passport. And these things are common across the world. It's not specific to the region, but those are huge, huge privileges that keep the door shut to a lot of people. I mean, and I think one of the biggest, most blatant buckets is the amount of women who are being funded in the region. The region actually has a higher than average amount of startup participation from women. But when you ask how much of that money, VC money, goes to women, only in 2020, only 2.2% of VC funding went to all women teams, 86% went to all male teams. And it becomes even more stark when you ask who is holding the purse strings, GPs. Dina, you may be the only woman.
No, not anymore. No.
Not anymore. Well, that's great. But we are seeing that change. But the people who hold those purse strings are of a specific profile as well. So we kind of preview in the article some ways that we can build more inclusive pipelines, and that does include a lot of the things that people have been mentioning, that some concrete actions that when we have these cultures of ownership and bringing people into companies, that is a great way to make a new founder. And we should be hiring people from many of these different backgrounds, exposing different backgrounds into these companies, and they will go out and they will solve problems, different types of problems based off of where they come from. Sharing this knowledge is also really important too. And just to get to kind of one of the core interests of the article we originally wrote, that is something that we should also ask from capital providers. We need to see GPs have different teams, and we also need to see commitments to accept founders of all different backgrounds. But I mean, all of that said, I think there's a lot of hope in the velocity of change that has been happening in the region, and we are seeing more and more stories. And I'm excited to see that continue to grow and become more inclusive.
Yes, Fadi, you can.
Look, let me add a couple of observations that are essential to think about as we think of the ecosystem. So the current ecosystem in today's world has a fundamental shift specifically in the Gulf. What we are seeing historically, the new companies and the new entrepreneurs that were popping up in the first, let's say, Web 2.0 era 10 years ago were mostly multinationals, expatriates that were in the region. In today's world, in Saudi Arabia, the overwhelming number of startups that are launched in Saudi Arabia are by Saudi nationals. That's a big statement because there was a historical discussion around these things. And I think in Kuwait it's the same. In the UAE, you're seeing much more across. In Bahrain, you're seeing much more. In Oman, you're seeing that. So this is a trend that originally people did not think of. It's not only the founders of these companies, it is a whole set of new skilled, if you want, employees in these companies that are nationals also, that are jumping into this new ecosystem that were previously the preference was to go work for government from the compatriots of these countries. But in today's world, you are seeing a shift. I mean, I don't know if it is big enough or if it's seismic, but I can tell you it's very noticeable, and it is quite incredible. And all the VCs, specifically in Saudi Arabia, are Saudi national led general partners of these VCs. So you have a new generation of venture funds that are enabled, obviously, by the government and by the sovereign wealth funds, because they understand that you need to create that skill set, that capability, that knowledge. And you can only do it by actually being the seed funders, being the first risk takers on these people, so that then you have a vibrant national ecosystem. Another thing that you need to talk about inclusiveness is that this region is, because it's a bubbling ecosystem, is attracting multinational talent to come and work here. There is, I mean, in Egypt, you find a huge talent pool in the country. In the Gulf, it used to be historically that you would attract people that wanted to come and work here for companies. Today, you are attracting the founders, and the startups are attracting multinational talent from South Asia, from Europe. Lots of Europeans are coming to work for startups in the ecosystem here. Karim and Hadir can help us. Karim attracted people from Silicon Valley to come and work here. So I mean, it's new. I mean, you had alluded to earlier that what MENA had said earlier, that our talent used to migrate and go or immigrate and go work in the West. Well, I think the ecosystem is bubbling enough now that at least the tech talent can find enough opportunities here to stick around and attract people from the outside.
So I want to ask I'm just going to ask a very honest, blunt question, because I think all of you have somehow become investors in your own right, not just founders. If you were to describe the typical profile of the entrepreneur that you tend to see, does it fit within, do they tend to have a lot of similarities in common, or are you truly seeing diversity in the pool of founders that are coming to seek capital? In other words, please, Mona, you got to go ahead.
So I'll jump in. I think Reggie touched on this kind of a stereotypical mold entrepreneur that we're seeing globally. And I think that still holds here, although we are seeing a shift, that stereotypical mold that is the male, middle-aged, has a pedigree academic background from usually a top business university, and certainly comes from an elite business network. Now, why is that even important? Why are we seeing more particularly successful startups and the unicorns coming with that mold? For many reasons. One of them is we've seen that experience under your belt actually helps you succeed. So whether it's experience with a large multinational or experience within another startup, you come with the tools and the resources that allow you to kind of dive in and not make as many mistakes. So that's the first thing. The other one is the vast majority of successful founders who come from elite universities or prestigious companies actually also come with a very strong network. And this is a network that they tap into for role models, for team members, for partners, for co-founders. We know most of the successful startups aren't solo co-founders or aren't solo founders. So they're tapping into their networks through their very smart background and supporting each other in the success. There's also a lot of parallels, and I've actually experienced this firsthand. If you look at professionals coming from the banking industry or consulting, there are a lot of parallels between the structured and problem-solving capabilities of consultants and what is required for an entrepreneur, especially in times of uncertainty. So for us, we feel that it's really, really important at this stage to almost democratize entrepreneurship. And you said this, Reggie, earlier, how do you cater to the entrepreneurs who don't come from these types of backgrounds, who don't have a network that can provide initial capital, who don't have an educational pedigree that is stellar, and who don't face discrimination like gender. And we know you mentioned earlier gender. The gender discrimination is very real. 2% of global capital goes to women. In this part of the world, it's less. It's about 1.2% of capital goes to women. And when female founders pitch their ideas, particularly at the early stage, they receive 63% less capital versus their male counterparts, and at lower valuations. Lower valuations are not an exception. They are the rule among women founders. So a complete shift has to happen in the ecosystem to allow for this inclusiveness. One of them is, VCs have to be proactive in increasing funders to these diverse founders, recognizing that diversity is actually key to growth of the ecosystem. The other one is, and this is something that we've seen, we've talked about women in STEM. Fewer than 20% of women have software development degrees. There has to be a structural change in the STEM education model to attract more women so that women can graduate from STEM into these types of roles. The third one is mentors. Most of the women that I speak to say that the reason they did not dive into the entrepreneurial bandwagon is because the scarcity or the lack of mentors. Again, I said it earlier, success breeds success. If other women have been in the ecosystem and have been successful, you're more likely to attract other women and minorities also. So mentors that fall outside that stereotypical cohort will attract other types of entrepreneurs. And then, obviously, last but not least, having females within the VC world and the investment banks, women who are actually making the decisions, as opposed to just being a seat on the board. And then again, success breeds success.
Yeah, so we have to wrap up. We have about 10 minutes. So I want to take a couple of questions from the participants, the audience, and I'll ask you all to answer very briefly. Delilah Khaled, who is also an MIT Foundry Fellow, is asking, what do you think inclusion means for MENA in our context? What does inclusion mean for us? And what would it take for us to commit to inclusion? And I think, Mona, you already answered that. But if we were to say, because I think inclusion in the United States means something very different than what it does for us in MENA.
Can I take a quick stab at this? Look, and this might be controversial. I think I don't feel that among the funders in the region, you have an inherent discriminatory environment, meaning a company that is, and the founder, whether woman or, and I can have a whole discussion with Muna around it, but I also agree with Muna on the woman side of things. But we fund everyone that comes with a good idea or a good startup. I haven't seen anybody that is inherently or purposefully not investing because a founder comes from a certain background or from a certain region. I mean, I don't want to make it look nicer than it is, but I haven't felt it. I mean, I need to be honest with that. There is a bit more it hasn't evolved. Maybe we're too early in the game to feel it, but I haven't felt it yet. And, you know, the entrepreneurs that get discriminated against are entrepreneurs that probably don't know how to scale in the region, because this region is a fragmented region, right? So we are 22 countries. When you talk about the Arab world or the Middle East, there is nothing called the Middle East. There are 22 countries in this region, and each country you have to work so hard in every regulatory ecosystem to create your own business. I mean, there are all sorts of frictions. The problem there, and sometimes, is, you know, some entrepreneurs come and think, you know, they've solved the problem in the country that they live in or in the city that they live in, but then how do you scale it in other places? And that's when people feel that they might be discriminated against or not looked favorably at.
Yeah.
I may comment on this, Dina. I think, yes, VC is after making money after all. Most of the VCs, regardless of the impact angle that everybody has, but ultimately they are after making money. So they don't basically differentiate between a male or female if they both are, they feel that they are capable to execute or to deliver something and they make them money. The only thing that I think that it needs more support from Impact Fund and people who have to support the inclusion is maybe in the early stage. In the very early stage, when people comes to pitch for money, sometimes it is the females need some support, initial support, and to give them equal chance. But after that, at the later stage, it becomes up to them, up to their execution. To be able to get the fair chance of getting funded and go ahead. So again, it is all about making a success. And if you, as investor, feels that whoever is pitching is able to do that, it will not make a difference if it is female or male.
Yeah,
I need to answer Dalia here and tell her there is no male bias, not on this panel. Not on this panel. I haven't over-negotiated with Mona when I invested in her. I haven't over-negotiated with Ula Dodin when I invested in her. I haven't over-negotiated when I invested with Hande in Turkey, which is the first $1 billion B2B startup. I didn't over-negotiate with them, nor downgrade their valuations because they were women. And in fact, I negotiate more when the founders are men who are a bit arrogant. So we have to be very careful when we throw statements out there.
I think that I honestly, Fadi, I think that you're an exception, not the norm. I do think that there is bias out there. You're not a representative of that, but we have.
But you brought me to the table here, so I have to state my opinion.
Yes, fair. So another question, that is absolutely fair. Another question from Amra Abdullah is, where do you see areas of improvements that the ecosystem in the region can make? And with so many organizations doing entrepreneurship trainings with focus on women, including EFE, what can be done differently? Any takers for that question?
I think I can take this one. I think if I would have a magic wand and ask for what can change, I would say more on the tech side. Of course, I'm a little bit biased to the reality that I'm based in Egypt, but even in UAE, we face this problem, which is attracting tech talent. So I think this is what we're lacking at the moment, and that's why a lot of startups are forced to move from Egypt to Dubai if they really want to scale and move forward. And by the way, there is just one point I wanted to add, maybe to a bit of a previous conversation, which is what we learned out of being in Careem or Uber or some of those big startups. And I think seeing startup scale is very important. So in the past, I used to tell passionate young entrepreneurs, guys, just go and start your own startups. Now I don't tell them that. I tell them, go and join another startup so you can see the scaling journey, and then you can take that forward and implement it in your own. So I just felt I needed to say that before finishing.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Hadid. I think the last question has to do with, how do you view the new UAE-Israeli relations in relation to our ecosystems in MENA? And do you think that there's an opportunity for Israeli founders to start more schools or madaris that graduate more founders, or even vice versa?
I don't know too much about the Israeli ecosystem. I know at the core of it, there is a network of army graduates and the whole set of support from the research and development of from the army. And so there is that basic core school where they emerge and find their own networks. There is very little for me to even comment on in terms of the Abrahamic Accords and how it has affected it, because it's too early. We don't know. We haven't seen enough. I haven't seen much of it here that I can comment on, if that is the question. I mean, it's still way too early to even see what that means for the entrepreneurial ecosystem here.
One thing that I will add just very quickly, and I think this ties both questions, is particularly the last 2 years, although we've seen change over the last 2 decades and the last 5 years, the last 2 years specifically has seen a range or a catalyst of change that is really unparalleled, from government intervention, government involvement in not only strategic ways we entrepreneurs operate, but operational nitty-gritties. How can they enable operational nitty-gritties? So all of these questions are, the reality is to be determined. I think what we're going to see in the next year is a tremendous continuous shift of the current status quo, with inclusion, with growth, with hypergrowth, with continued capital. And I think we're at the start of a tipping point that is one of change, whatever that means, to be determined. But I think the fundamentals are set.
Yes, I agree with you. And just to wrap up, I here at MIT, people are always telling me, Dina, you're so biased towards MENA. You're so biased towards MENA. And the truth is, I am biased, but it's also built on a true belief that the region has so much opportunity and that so much has changed over the past 2 decades that I've, witnessed entrepreneurship. And so my last question to each of you, and Fadi, I love to end my panels with this question, is what are you most hopeful about moving forward when it comes to being a part of this very rapidly changing ecosystem? Whether it be in Dubai or Egypt or elsewhere in the region. And Reggie, I'm going to start with you because, I know you're going to write another piece after this panel. What have you drawn from it that makes you very hopeful?
Yeah, definitely. I think something that stuck out for me that I highlighted here in my notes is, Mona, when you said there's been a shift from, at the beginning of the ecosystems, solving user problems. Now it's people want to exit for IPOs, and there needs to be a return to creating for value. And I think that's very exciting when we see companies that are solving problems of financial inclusion or transportation, and that these are the companies that become unicorns because they're solving problems for a lot of people. I think that's something that's really exciting to see in the region. And I'm hopeful to see more of this type of approach, that entrepreneurship can solve problems. And that's what makes people excited. That's what attracts investors to become more of the norm. So that's what I'm hopeful for.
Adir, you're always hopeful, so I know this is not hard for you.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm an optimistic person by nature, and just looking at where that startup ecosystem was there 10 years ago. And when I was saying everything changed in the last 2 years, I think every year it changes, and it's just super exciting to be part of that and to try to expect what's going to happen next. I think I'm mostly excited about seeing the talent that's coming out of that. When I see people that were part of my team, for example, and then later on they end up starting their own startups that gets funding and becomes successful. I think this is what I'm mostly excited about, is to see those lives changing just because of a small experience that we've had together.
Yeah, Mohammed.
Honestly, I think I'm hoping that we find one day out of this dynamic ecosystem, companies that grows and acquire other companies similar in the other part of the world. Not like Uber acquiring Careem, but I would love to have an Uber of the Middle East, someone that can grow and become international enough to acquire other companies, and for the people from this area to lead and become a leader of the global digital economy.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
I think we will start seeing that. Mona.
Yes, I mean, I'll echo that, creating global companies from the local ecosystem, but companies that are truly solving for value needs and creating ecosystem value, as opposed to smoke and mirror. I'd like to see that the collapse of smoke and mirror and creating scale of true consumer value and ecosystem value. That's what I'd love to see. And it's coming.
Yeah. Fadi, what are you most hopeful about you've been a part of the start of this ecosystem till now?
I am most hopeful about the generation of builders that are emerging, that are changing the face of the economies of this region. These are not from your traditional families, traditional backgrounds, or have made their wealth from the traditional way that wealth was done here in the region. So there's new wealth, there's new empowerment, there's a whole set of a certain class of executives and entrepreneurs who are just emerging. And I don't think we have yet felt their big impact. And I think that's where I'm most hopeful. I think we're going to see a completely changed region in the coming 10 years.
Fantastic. It's a lot to look forward to. Makes me want to come back very quickly. Thank you guys all for the time that you took to be with us on and being part of this discussion. And thanks to all those who joined us. This was a live stream too, so thank you to everyone who has been a part of it, and thank you to MEI and Reggie. Thank you for bringing all of us together to have this important conversation. Everyone, keep your eyes open. Reggie will be writing a follow-up piece, so we'll be sharing that with you as